Oh, how I remember those days well. Occasionally, Sheila and I would hear a cry in the night from one of our younger kids many years ago now, and they would sometimes yell for dad. And when one of them would yell for me, then I knew what the problem was. But if they didn't feel good, they would almost always call for their mom. But when they were scared, they called for dad. So I would stumble into the room half awake and hear one of them say something to the effect of, "I'm scared." And sometimes it was because of a bad dream. Sometimes it was because they thought they saw something move. But what really frightened them, what really scared them more than anything else, was the darkness. They were, to varying degrees, like a lot of kids, afraid of the dark. So I would simply turn on the hallway light, leave the bedroom door cracked a little bit, and then kiss them on the forehead as they fall back to sleep. Darkness. Darkness. The word is probably best defined as the absence of light. It's not so much something that you see, it's something that you don't see. When there's not very much light, you have darkness. And when it's really dark, when you can't see your hand in front of your face, then the darkness becomes something that you feel. Darkness is spoken of some 200 times in the Bible. The Bible uses darkness as a metaphor to describe what life is like without God. When you live without His love, when you refuse to follow His direction, when you choose your foolishness over His wisdom, you're going to find yourself in a dark place sooner or later. Now, here's what I want you to understand from the beginning today. Until you grasp the extent of the darkness in this world, you won't be able to celebrate the light of Christmas. So I want to talk with us about the darkness. Now, I recognize this is not going to fill your hearts with holiday cheer, and I don't want to be like Cousin Eddie on your Christmas vacation. But before we talk about the light, we need to recognize the darkness that surrounds us. This is part one of a series of messages this December about Christmas lights. But I want you to understand we have become almost experts to some extent at darkness because our eyes have adjusted to it. An Amber Alert comes over your phone, and it's just another drive that you take to the store or to work. The news reports of another murder in Kansas City or another school shooting, and we lie on the couch and grab another handful of chips because we've grown used to it. Somebody down the street's arrested for domestic violence. A teenager commits suicide. A fatal car accident has backed up traffic on the interstate, but we're frustrated because we're going to be late getting home from a shopping trip. A police officer was killed this week in Texas, and others have been shot this week. But most of us don't even raise an eyebrow at that kind of news anymore because, again, our eyes have adjusted to the darkness. You see, the reason we don't always notice the darkness, and this is hard for me to admit, but it's true, is that we are part of the problem. We're part of the darkness. In fact, with the lights out in a room, I feel more comfortable telling you that what often scares me the most is my own darkness. Did I really just talk to my spouse that way? Did I really just let my eyes watch that? My mind think that? Did I really just cheat on that test? Did last night really happen? Where did that come from? We've probably all asked those questions, those types of questions, at least one time or another in our life. And have you ever been caught off guard by the darkness within you? There is darkness within each of us. And can I tell you something? I may not be a child, but I'm still afraid of the dark within me. So you're in bed next to your spouse and you've gotten into a fight over something silly earlier in the evening, but your pride is hurt and you feel unloved. You feel disrespected, so you turn your backs towards each other and you yank the blankets to make sure that you have a little bit more than your share. And you think to yourself, okay, I'll show them tomorrow. It's going to be the silent treatment all day. Now you could turn over and put your hand gently on your spouse's back and tell your husband or tell your wife, I'm sorry, I love you, we'll work through this tomorrow. But what do you choose? So many times we choose darkness, don't we? So I'm leaving Kansas City. I'm driving down I-49. I'm still in the metro area, in the Grandview area, heading south where the interstate begins to narrow from like 4 lanes through Grandview to just before you get to Belton. It merges down a lane, reduces a lane, and I'm slowed down. I'm in just before that merging point. I'm in the next to the farthest left lane, and the left lane is going to disappear within a few hundred yards. And as I get close to that spot of no return, where that lane just disappears and the traffic's supposed to have already been merged, I look at my rearview mirror as I drive, and I see it. I see somebody who is doing their best to hurry down through there before they run out of lane and to squeeze their way in front of as many people as possible. And it happens all the time. I understand that. Probably happens every day. When people leave Kansas City on rush hour on the way home. But just before they think they're going to be completely out of room, they're going to cut their way into traffic. And it's aggravating, isn't it? If you ever had that experience, maybe not there, but someplace. Now, I can roll my window down and brake a little bit with a smile on my face, and I can motion them in front of me as they go by me. But I feel the darkness come and start to take over me, and what I really want to do is I see them coming back there, maybe 300 or 400 yards yet, is I really want to pull over to where I'm straddle of the 2 lanes to where they can't get around me, as if I'm scouting the traffic ahead or something like that. But I'm really wanting to block them, that impatient driver who doesn't want to wait in line way back there behind me. That's what I want to do. Well, let me tell you a few things about the darkness that you need to understand as we get started today. For one thing, the darkness has always been there. It's always been where? It's always been a part of you. Ever since your adolescent years. You felt it when you were a kid and you lied to your parents about knocking over the vase. You felt it when you slipped the lifesavers into your pocket while your mom was checking out the grocery store. And any parent of a 2-year-old can tell you the darkness has always been there. You don't have to teach a child to say no, to stick out their tongue in defiance, or to throw a temper tantrum. You don't have to teach them to do that, because the darkness has already been there. But secondly, the darkness is naturally progressive. Darkness will grow and grow, and it'll eventually begin to overtake the light in a person. When Jesus was arrested just before his crucifixion, the night before his crucifixion, we read in Luke chapter 22, verse 53, a mob, including some of the chief priests, the temple guards, the Jewish elders, came to the Garden of Gethsemane to arrest him in the darkness. And this is what we read there. He said to them, "This is the hour when darkness reigns." And when darkness reigns, man is capable of unbelievable acts, unbelievable evil. And perhaps today I'm speaking to someone who has lost themselves in the darkness. You thought you could control the darkness, at least in certain areas of your life, but just like a dimmer dial on a living room lights, things have gotten dimmer and dimmer, darker and darker, and you've discovered the darkness will always take you further than you had planned to go. It takes you from yelling at your kids to hitting them. It takes you from a couple of drinks to not being able to go a day without getting drunk. It takes you from looking at a few pages that are kind of risque in a catalog to spending hours and hours and hours looking at graphic images on the internet. It takes you from stealing a few dollars out of petty cash to embezzling thousands. It takes you from a little indulgence to crippling credit card debt. There was a song out many years ago now by Casting Crowns, a contemporary Christian music group, that captures the progression of darkness And some of you who follow that group, listen to their music, you can remember the song, I'm sure. It was entitled Slow Fade. And the chorus goes like this. It's a slow fade when you give yourself away. It's a slow fade when black and white have turned to gray. Thoughts invade, choices are made, a price will be paid when you give yourself away. People never crumble in a day. It's a slow fade. It's a slow fade. That's the way that darkness takes over. Like a child who wakes up and finds themselves in the dark, alone, afraid, and uncertain, there is a sense of panic. And our first response and our only hope really is to cry out in the darkness for our Father, our Heavenly Father. So I want you to know that Christmas is God's answer to that darkness. See, that's really why we can celebrate this time of year. It's because into this dark world, God brought a light, the light of His Son, Jesus Christ. Now, if you've been sitting in the darkness, turn on some lights. Typically, when we study the Christmas accounts, we look at Luke chapter 2 or Matthew chapter 1 and 2, which provide us more of a historical account of the birth of Christ. It's how we're used to reading the birth narratives of Jesus. But I love the way that John in his gospel presents the birth of Jesus and how John the Baptist announced that Christ had come into the world. And really, to understand his words here, you need to acknowledge the darkness of this world that we live in and also the darkness that lives within us. So in John chapter 1, in understanding that, John chapter 1 announces the birth of Christ this way, and he says in verse 9, the true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. So Jesus is announced as the true light that gives light to the darkness. And that's why we celebrate. That into our dark world, a light has broken through, and the light has a name. His name is Jesus. And Jesus said a few chapters later in John chapter 8, verse 12, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And so Jesus is the light that shines into the darkness. Have you ever wondered where we come up with this whole tradition of Christmas lights, hanging lights in and on our houses and stuff? Well, someone found this and sent it to me. And he found it. I'm not sure what his source was, but I think it's pretty insightful. It really gives us the history of how this happened in our country. The wives of the nation years ago got together, had a secret meeting, thought the way to drive their husbands crazy. Someone thought up this idea of putting lights on their house. And someone raised their hand in the group and said, I know what we could do. We could 3 or 4 times a year, we could have our husbands rearrange the furniture in the house, and then when we're all finished, we could tell them that we like it better the way it was originally. And the room applauded. They thought that was a good idea. And then someone said, I know what we can do. We can wake up our husbands in the middle of the night and say, did you hear that? And then we kind of doze back off to sleep as they have checked out everything, and then they lay there in the darkness and can't go back to sleep. And the room applauded, and the wives loved that idea. And then another woman raised her hand, and she said, I know, I've got it. I'm just thinking out loud here, but what if over the Thanksgiving holiday, we would have them climb up on these dangerous ladders and hang lights off the eave of the house, and have them hang lights all around the outside of the house and in the yard and do things like that. And everybody thought that was a wonderful idea. Another wife said, I know what we can do. We can make these lights out of some substance that mysteriously would get tangled up when it's been stored. And by the time we drag them back out and help our husbands pull them back out the next Thanksgiving, there'll be a tangled mess. And everybody applauded and thought that was a wonderful idea. And then one of the wives finally said, I've got it. This is the ultimate. What if we made it where these lights on these strands, if one of them burned out, the whole set would go black. The whole set would be out. And the room just stood, and they gave that idea a standing ovation and applauded. It was a great idea. So that's the tradition of how Christmas lights began. Just so you know, that's how it came to pass. Now, it turns out that's not accurate at all, okay? Or at least that's what they want us to believe. But here is what happened. You can trace the history of Christmas lights back to the medieval period. Before there was even electricity, there were followers of Christ who would take a candle at this time of year and they would light that candle and put it in a prominent, visible place in their home, oftentimes in a window. As a symbol that Jesus is really the reason for that season, that the light of the world had come. Now that slowly evolved to what we do today, is we hang these lights and decorations on our house and inside our house and string lights on a Christmas tree, those kinds of things. But originally it meant, and it should mean today, those lights should be a reminder that Jesus, the light of the world, has come into our darkness. And so this Christmas season, when you're driving through the neighborhood or you're stringing lights up around the house, would you be intentional in your own heart and mind? Would you be intentional with your children or your grandchildren when you talk with them and say, listen, this is why we do this. It's a reminder that into our dark world, Jesus was born and a light gave light to all men. As he came into the darkness, he came to bring us light and to save us. Now, I am guessing that there are some listening to this or watching this who really need to hear this today, because you're experiencing some darkness of despair in your own life. Maybe because something this year has just not gone at all like you had hoped and planned. Things were just not the way you wanted them to be. Would you let the light of God's hope come into your life and bring you relief, bring you healing? That people who live, and if you're experiencing the darkness of suffering, maybe some physical suffering that you're going through, or someone that you love is going through that, would you let the light of God's joy come into your heart? I mean, if you have the darkness of anxiety and it's just a cloud over you right now, would you let the light of God's peace break through your darkness this Christmas season? And maybe you find yourself in the dark because of your own past mistakes or failures earlier this year, or maybe many years ago, and it still seems that you're paying for those mistakes. You just made some decisions that you wish you could have over. You wish you could go back and do some things differently. And you wonder, why did I do that? Why did I get involved in that relationship? How did that happen? How did I get caught up with this that I'm facing now? I am telling you that no matter how dark things are for you right now, the light of Jesus can break through yet in your life. And that's why we celebrate Christmas. The light has come into the darkness. One of the first prophecies about Jesus, one of my favorite prophecies, is found in Isaiah chapter 9. And here's what it says in verses 1 and 2. It talks about the time the Messiah would come. It says, there will be no more gloom for those who are in distress. And in verse 2, he writes, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. That's what Jesus came to do. He came to shine his light into our darkness. Do you remember studying the principle of photosynthesis? You remember that? It was this idea that the sun in the sky brings light to earth, and that causes us to have life. That without the sun, there would be no life on this planet, because it brings life to plants and to humans, who are then able to exist, to flourish. The sun brings vitality to red and white blood cells. It strengthens our immune systems. It's been shown that the sun and sunshine bring a sense of well-being, that people who live in parts of the world where the sun doesn't shine for some points, in another northern hemisphere up around the North Pole this time of year, there are certain places where they have weeks and weeks and weeks of darkness without any sunshine, ever, for days on end, weeks on end. But where there are gloomier climates, even in the lower 48, there are higher suicide rates as a rule. It's just this idea that sun brings life physically here on earth. And what's true physically is also true spiritually. God has designed it oftentimes that way, that what we see in the physical realm is often true in the spiritual realm as well. And just as the sun brings life here on earth physically, the Son of God brings life spiritually. He brings life to our souls. And without Jesus in your life, you don't have life that is really life, what you are created to have. You don't. You can't. In 1 John chapter 5, verse 12, the little epistle of 1 John, 5th chapter, verse 12, John writes this. He says, he who has the Son has life. He who does not have the Son of God does not have life. You're a walking dead person. It's just that simple. If you don't have Jesus, you don't have real life. Now, you might have an imitation of life. You might have a version or an existence, but not real life. That's only found in Jesus Christ. And so the gospel writer, John, announces the birth of Jesus this way, that the light that brings light to all men was being born into the world. And as soon as he talks about Jesus as this light, he makes it clear there are many people who shun the light. That's just one of the responses that we see even this time of year, that people shun the light. So look at John chapter 1, now back in the Gospel of John. John chapter 1, verse 4 and 5, he writes, in him, that is in Jesus, was life, and that life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness. And then he says, but the darkness has not understood it. Now that makes sense to some of you, I'm guessing, because when you became a Christian, you gave life to Jesus, or you became part of your church family, you tried to explain that to other people that you love the most, people you care about, and some of them just don't get it. They just don't get it. They don't understand it. And sometimes the harder you try to explain it, the more they seem not to understand. And John says oftentimes the darkness does not understand the light. And then in verse 11, John 1:11, he says, Jesus came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. So the Creator came to those that he made, and they rejected him. And so what we have oftentimes is those in darkness will shun the light. Now, for those of us who have seen the light, there is nothing more frustrating than having someone we love and care about who refuse the light being born into their life. And some of you feel that, I know, over the holidays, because you'll be with a parent who just refuses to have a rational conversation about the person of Jesus. You'll be with a teenager in your house, or maybe a college student that comes back home, or a niece or a nephew, and they just seem to be making one poor decision after another, and it's so clear to you. I mean, you can see it, but they just can't see it. Or maybe it's a coworker who's just getting ready to make this huge mistake and walk out on his wife and kids. And you want them to see the light, but they don't see it. Or maybe it's a neighbor who feels overwhelmed by the financial pressures and he's just kind of discouraged and down and gloomy all the time. And you want him to understand that's not what life is all about, that there's true life, but they just don't see it. Why? There's a book, it's entitled Into Thin Air. Into Thin Air. It was written by a man named John Krakauer. And in this book, he tells about Andy Harris, who was an expedition leader, and he took people to the summit on Mount Everest a number of times. Okay? So he was very well experienced. And in this book, Into Thin Air, Krakauer tells about one time Harris had went to the top of Mount Everest, and he stayed a little bit too long at the peak, and on his descent down, he became in dire need of oxygen. And those at the base camp had made sure there was plenty of oxygen canisters, full canisters, at different points on coming down from the summit on the descent. And Harris finds some oxygen canisters, and he radios down and says, well, I see some of these canisters, but they're empty. And they radio back, no, they're not empty. They're full. We have full ones there. All of them they're full. They're all full. He says, no, there's no oxygen in them. Well, have you tried them? He says, no, I haven't tried them. They're empty. No, every one of them is full. We just left them there. We just left them there for you. They're empty. And he just kept arguing with them that they were empty when they were indeed full. And he said, I'm not going to try them. And Mount Everest claimed another life. And in his book, Krakauer tells about just the frustration of those who were trying to help him. That what would give him life was right there in front of him, but he could not see it. Why couldn't he see it? Because he got too low on it. He didn't have it, enough of it. He couldn't see the oxygen was there because he didn't have enough. He's got to the point where he didn't have it. He waited too long. And the same, tragically so, is true spiritually as well. It is very, very difficult for those who are in the darkness for much of their life to get to the point where they can ever see the light. It's right there. We can see it. Why don't they see it? And we don't understand why they don't see it. It's because they've been in the darkness so long, they don't have it. They can't see it. But that's one of the reasons why we as a church intentionally shine the light even more brightly in our lives with our service, with the way we love people and we're concerned for them, so that those who are in the darkness will see it, that it becomes obvious. They cannot miss it. Now, John says that many will shun the light, so they won't understand it for some time, maybe. And if you keep reading in the Gospel of John over in the 3rd chapter, a couple of chapters over verse 19, you know John 3:16, but many people stop reading too quick. Verse 19 says, he gives another reason why people reject the light. He says, this is the judgment, this is the verdict. Let me just break this down for you. He says, the light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light because their deeds were evil. Many people, he says, reject the light simply because of the fact the darkness can be fun. And they've got to the point where they like the darkness. Now, they may say to you, I just really don't buy into this, that Jesus was the Son of God. Or they may come up with this, I don't believe that the Bible is reliable. I think it's full of mistakes. I think it's trustworthy. Now, the truth is, with many of them, that's just their outward alibi. But many people reject the light simply because they like the darkness. The darkness can be pleasurable for a period, maybe much of their life. And they don't often acknowledge that, but there is this pull, there is this appeal that the darkness has on us, and the longer we're in it, the more it traps us. You see, it's not difficult for me to preach this and say, you got to choose the light and do everything I can to make it easier for other people to make that decision. But oftentimes I have this inner struggle with darkness. Several years ago, my middle grandson, Peyton, I remember taking him to McDonald's, which at that time was one of his favorite places to go to. And at that point, he wanted to have a Happy Meal. And there was a choice with his Happy Meal that he could have fries with his cheeseburger, or he could have a fruit cup, I think it was, at that time. And so I made the decision. It was easy for me to make this decision for him as his grandpa, that he's going to have the cheeseburger and the fruit cup, and he's going to like it, He's not going to be complaining about it. It's the right thing to do. But fast forward later that evening, and my wife and I are out at a restaurant together. And it's my turn to choose the sides for myself with my entree. And I see that I can have a side salad. And so I choose that. And I get one other side with my entree. And it has a list of green vegetables. And I like almost every green vegetable I can think of. But I also see that part of the sides listed there are something else I really like called mashed potatoes and gravy. And they're just calling out my name. There's this pull to it. And what was a very easy decision for me to make on behalf of my grandson, and that's what he should do. When it's my struggle, when it's my battle, when it's my temptation, I can feel the darkness. I can feel the darkness. And John says, I'm paraphrasing now, don't be surprised when people refuse the light because they just like the dark. The dark can be fun. And in Proverbs, we read of a father who's trying to warn his son of the darkness of sexual immorality instead of making it sound like this horrible thing that he wouldn't enjoy or receive any pleasure from. He acknowledges the appeal of the darkness. Listen to the way he describes it, Proverbs 5:3. For the lips of the adulteress drip honey. Her speech is smoother than oil. So it calls out to us. And the darkness and the light, which seems like such an easy decision for me to make for somebody else, don't we all know that when it comes to our own struggles, it can be really tough. I remember back a few years ago now, I had a letter across my desk that was written by a college graduate from a university here in Missouri, actually in the northwestern part of the state. The letter was originally written by a staff member, written to a staff member of campus ministry there, and then I called and got permission to read this section of this letter to you. And in the letter, the writer, this college grad, talked about how she went to college confident in her faith and her values. She knew who she was as a person. But then she tells her what happened when she got to college and lived in the dorm. Here's what she writes. Most of the conversation or subject matter taking place in the lobby or study areas of the dorm were sexual in nature, and I became more and more aware of the prevalence of casual sex. And I heard students nonchalantly telling stories of switching partners or even engaging in group sex on campus. And those of us who were not involved were in the minority, or so it seemed, and ostracized as closed-minded or conservative, old-fashioned. One Thursday night, she says, I went down to the basement area of the dorm to a study area, only to find about 25 students, male and female, together watching pornographic movies. Upon reporting it, I was told by the resident hall advisor that they did this every Thursday night. If I didn't like it, don't go down there. You don't have to participate. You don't have to watch. More than once, she says, I walked past 30-gallon garbage cans on the third floor of my dorm, overflowing with beer cans and liquor bottles. They didn't have to hide their drinking, and many of the resident advisors saw alcohol as a normal part of college life. And over time, she writes, these behaviors began to affect me. It was very difficult to withstand the peer pressure when you are submerged in an environment where this behavior is the norm, and pure intentions are viewed as weird. If you said that you didn't drink or that you were not sexually active, people looked at you as if you were a freak. And over time, the alienation I felt led me to doubt myself. And I began to believe them that I was abnormal and there was something wrong with me, she writes. If on the day I moved into the dorm you told me that I would eventually start drinking and smoking pot, I would have told you, you are crazy. But see, folks, that's the appeal of the darkness. Now, I know there are probably some of you uncomfortable listening to me read those kinds of comments. But until we shine a light on the darkness, it'll continue to have power over us and our children and our grandchildren. We cannot afford to look the other way. We cannot afford to naively just walk into the darkness and send our children into the darkness and pretend like everything is going to be all right. There's a battle going on between light and darkness, and the darkness has the most power when the light refuses to shine upon it. And people who are in the dark and doing the things they do in the darkness, they don't want the light shining on them, obviously. And that's why, as a church, sometimes when we shine our light, it's not appreciated. But part of the role of the children of the light is to shine the light in the darkness. And this is not optional. We must. We're called to. Now, John says most people won't like that. There'll be many people who won't like that. The darkness does not like the light. But then he goes on to challenge us to shine the light that as Christians, that's our goal. Our purpose, to shine the light of Christ. To live so close to Jesus, people can't help but see him. Whether they get uncomfortable or not is immaterial. I want you to listen to the words of Jesus from Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill can't be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and then put it under a bowl. They don't cover it up. Instead, they put it on a stand. That way, the light can give light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven." That they would see your good deeds that you do, the way you love for them, the way you care for them, the way that you serve them, regardless of how they respond or how they treat you, that you do that as a follower of Jesus, as children of God, and they will undoubtedly, eventually, associate that with the Lord God. And when there's any inquiry why at all, it's the open door that you need to share your verbal testimony. The shining of light brightly in this dark world happens the most when we live lives full of compassion and service and love. So more so than our doctrinal purity, more so than our political stances, more so than our moral superiority, when we show love to people, unqualified love, when we do good deeds to meet a need they have, it shines the light of Christ brightly, even if they don't acknowledge it initially. So we have to intentionally, thoughtfully, with preparation of prayer, love and serve others, be equipped to give the verbal testimony at the right time when the door opens, because it will open with most people. Be able to give a defense, reasons why you believe. And there is a plethora there are libraries of material to help equip you to be able to adequately give an apology, a good defense. Not an excuse for your belief, but reasons, apologetics, reasons why you believe what you believe as a child of the light. But that happens by the way you care for people, the way you love them and serve them, regardless of the risk, regardless of how they initially respond. Now, here's the easy question for you today. Where's the light most needed? Well, in the dark, right? We get together on Sundays in a church building and sometimes mistakenly think, well, I'm really letting my light shine here in church. Well, yeah, you are. It's a lot harder in darkness, isn't it? But that's what happens when we go to school, when we are on our campuses, we go to our jobs or in our homes at times, when our light seems to have a dimmer switch on it, and we just ease off the light a little bit at a time, dim it down to the point where it's barely noticeable, so we don't cause much of a ruckus. We don't get much negative feedback. And, the dark environment stays dark, but the challenge is for us to shine our light bright there. A couple of years ago, I saw an article about New Life Church in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and they had an event called Wait No More. In the state of Colorado, at that time, in their foster care system, there were, at that time, 790 children waiting to be adopted. 1,300 people came to this church for this Wait No More event, and about 250 families took the first steps towards adopting one of those children who were in foster care waiting to be adopted. And the goal of this church was that there would be no children in the state of Colorado who were in foster care waiting to be adopted. And when asked about the motivation, the pastor simply said, well, Jesus has called us to take care of the widows and the orphans, and so we're trying to do that. And the light is shining a little more brightly in the city of Colorado Springs because of that church's efforts. So the question is, what can you do to shine the light? Maybe he's calling you to adopt a child, to take that step. Now, there's a lot of people who adopt pets out of animal shelters, and that's noble enough. But what about a person? What about a child that needs a home? I would just challenge you. Between now and Christmas, here it is, Sunday the 5th of December. You get 20 days. If you have children or grandchildren, get them involved with this. Just think of 3 or 4 ways that you can shine the light of Jesus this Christmas season. And if you don't have kids at home or your grandchildren aren't local, your grandkids aren't nearby, but think of some ways that you still can make that happen. I mean, maybe it's just something as simple as taking some cookies to a neighbor or taking a meal over to someone that you know's been down under the weather. Or, when the weather turns icy or something, you're willing to scrape ice off of windshields or shovel some sidewalks or whatever. Put a little encouraging note in a child's lunch box. Maybe you talk to a teacher at school that and just ask, are there any students in your class that need some help with some school supplies or some extra clothes this time of year? And you just anonymously meet that need. Or you take coffee and donuts to people at work, or to the fire station or the police station, local law enforcement office. What are some ways you can make a difference and just let the light of Christ shine? Imagine if every one of us who are watching this or listening to this as followers of Jesus Christ just came up with just a small list of things that we could intentionally do to shine the light of Christ into the darkness around us, because that's what we're called to do as Christians. But please remember this, that this light that you're to shine is not a self-generated light, but it's light that comes from the light of the world within you. When you accept Jesus as your Savior, He makes your heart your home, and that light starts to shine through you. And perhaps I'm talking to someone who knows they're in the darkness right now, and you've not lived in the light. And you feel this darkness because of some circumstances in your life. Or maybe you feel the darkness of a decision from the past. It's your own sin, your own mistakes. And I'm just telling you, the light of Jesus can break through. I don't care how dark things are for you right now. The light of Jesus can break through. The very first words of God ever recorded in Scripture come from Genesis chapter 1, verse 3. Here's the very first words of God. Let there be light. And He spoke those words into the darkness, and the very next phrase is, and there was light. And into your darkness, God wants to speak these same words today. Let there be light. So if you need to talk to somebody about surrendering your life to Jesus Christ and letting the light of God come and illuminate your life, your heart, your soul, you reach out to me at steve.altide@sbcglobal.net, or call me at 660-342-3068. Or you go talk to the local church pastor, the Christian church. But don't let this Christmas season continue with you living in the dark. Jesus Christ wants to shine His light in your life and bring you life.